Hi guys, I'm Kristen. Welcome and welcome back. Get out your cozy scarves, candles, and pumpkin spice lattes because it's time to talk about some fall books. Now, depending on where you live, it might not actually be fall yet, but where I am, it is. And for what YouTube tells me, the majority of my viewers and subscribers, it is fall. But I do know that it's not fall in the Southern Hemisphere. We're just gonna roll with it. There is something so unique about the fall season in that it seems to be the season that has the most distinct sense of atmosphere. In particular for readers, especially readers who read seasonally, it seems to have like the most distinctive and clear set of thematic books that seem to fit with the season. Now, obviously, Halloween does play into that because throughout October, I feel like people generally tend to read more like spooky, witchy, vampire, paranormal things. But even outside of the more Halloween, spooky, or paranormal, witchy type books, fall also seems to really lend itself well to reading books that are really cozy and quiet, or perhaps reading fairy tale retellings, or books that are particularly woodsy and atmospheric in nature. So as we are coming up into this season, I wanted to share some of the particularly fall vibes books that I have on my radar for this season. Now, these are not all of the books that I plan to be reading. It's not an extensive TBR for the fall for me, but it is the ones that I think are particularly fit that fall vibes theme. A note on my voice, I do have a bit of a cold right now, so nothing more seasonal than that. So no pumpkin spice latte here for me. I'm just drinking honey and lemon, and I apologize for my voice. Okay, let's jump into it. I have broken down my fall vibes TBR into a couple distinct categories. So the first one here is like fairy tale retellings or more woodsy historical fantasy, kind of cozy leaning books. The first of which is one of the books that I'm actually currently reading, and that is The Weaver and the Witch Queen by Genevieve Gornichek. This is from the same author that wrote The Witch's Heart a couple years ago, and it is a historical fantasy set in Norway in Viking Age era time period. We're following two women whose lives are intertwined for various reasons, one of whom wants a quiet life but is then disrupted when her sister is taken away and wants only to then find her sister. And the other one wants to become a powerful witch but is also destined to become one of the first most powerful queens of Norway. I feel like historical fantasy books as well as Scandinavian setting books feel really like fall and woodsy to me because of just like the setting. They're like a little bit more cozy, even if they're like gritty around the edges. I just feel like there's something like distinctly fall feeling to historical fantasies. And then Scandinavian setting, like especially with Viking era, I don't know, it just like seems like kind of like dark and gritty and fireplaces and fjords and all of that. Like that, I feel like that setting feels really fall related to me. I'm just like, the imagery is very like the show Vikings in my head for this as well. And there's also a little bit of that witchy element with one of the main characters as well. Another historical fantasy that I think is going to be particularly woodsy in feel and where it's really like the setting that makes me think fall vibes, and that is The Words of Kings and Prophets by Shauna Lawless. This is the second book in the series Gale Song, the first of which was The Children of Gods and Fighting Men. It was one of my favorite books from the first half of the year. This one is coming out in September, I think. Yes. So I'm really excited and looking forward to picking this up. In this book, we're following two women, each of whom represent some of the mythical founding peoples of Ireland, and that's why like Ireland I think is a really fall feeling setting. And these two women are both kind of set on a political journey, each of whom have to kind of take power for themselves in a time period where women do not really have a lot of power or agency. And the two women are extremely different people, and they go about this path to agency in very different ways. I absolutely fell in love with the first book. I loved the perspectives that each of the two women brought, even though one is obviously like a lot more likable than the other one. Even the less likable one is at least like really intriguing. We're also getting swept up into some of the changing politics within Ireland at this time. It's a time period where there are many kings throughout Ireland, with one high king, and there are different like Irish kings as well as some Viking settler kings. So I just like really, really loved what had happened so far, and I thought the ending was really intriguing. I think the storyline is going to be coming a little bit more closer towards each other. The two storylines are coming towards each other, and I just can't wait to get into this like really woodsy historical setting once more. Another woodsy read that I have my eye on here is The Wolf and The Woodsman by Ava Reid. Now, I originally had my eye on this when it first came out, I think in 2021, as a possible anticipated release, but I never ended up picking it up just for various reasons, and I think it had like some mixed reception at the time. But it is one that I have always kind of still thought about. Would really like to give this author a try, and I think that this book is probably going to be a better fit for me than their other work that I am aware of, Juniper Thorn. In this one, it is inspired by Hungarian history and Jewish mythology. We're following a young pagan woman with hidden powers and a one-eyed captain of the woodsman as they form an unlikely alliance to thwart a tyrant. I think this one honestly is going to be a little bit of a mix between that like woodsy, foresty vibes as well as maybe like a little bit dark. I have heard that it's a little bit darker and like potentially a little bit gory or graphic, so I'm aware of that going in, but I think that that adds to the feeling of it being really well suited to read in the fall. And I think that we're following like this one main character who is very ostracized within her community because of her powers, and she is given up by the villagers as a sacrifice to a group of woodsmen, like a holy order that comes through the village. But then all of the woodsmen except for one are killed or attacked by monsters on their journey, and so only she and this captain survive. But of course he's no ordinary woodsman, and of course her powers are, you know, a little bit more important than maybe they seemed to the villagers. So it has some familiar tropes, but I think that it is going to be like a dark version of those tropes. Needless to say, I think it is going to be very, very fall vibes, very woodsy and a little bit dark. So I think it will be perfect for this season, and I'm excited to check it out. Then we have Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott. And this came out last year. I did have my eye on it and I just totally forgot about it and never got around to it. But this is it was a debut novel, and it is a little bit of a fairy tale retelling in that it is a Baba Yaga retelling. So it has more of an Eastern European folklore kind of feeling to it, which is always really nice to get something a little bit different. I do think that books that have that like really clear folklore feeling, a little bit, or even fairy tale retellings, I feel like really bring that sense of fall atmosphere. Although I think this one might have a possibly modern setting. I can't quite get the gist of it here, but I'll read a little bit of the synopsis to get a better sense here. The Yaga siblings, Bellatine, a young woodworker, and Isaac, a wayfaring street performer and con artist, have been estranged since childhood. But when they learn they are to receive a mysterious inheritance, the siblings are reunited, only to discover that their bequest isn't land or money, but something far stranger, a sentient house on chicken legs. Thistlefoot, as the house is called, has arrived from the Yaga's ancestral home in Russia, but not alone. A sinister figure known only as the Long Shadow Man has tracked it to American shores, bearing with him violent secrets from the past. I'll leave it there, but I do also see some tags here for horror and magical realism, so this one might be another one that kind of melds or straddles that line between like woodsy and ethereal folklore kind of vibes, as well as like maybe a little bit more dark and eerie. But it just has such a cool cover, and I love that it is a Baba Yaga kind of inspired story, which is something really different, although there was a couple that came out last year. But in general, this is a unique retelling or folklore inspired story, so I am curious to see what it brings. And then the last one here that I have in this category that I don't really think fits in this category, but I didn't really know where else to put it, and that is Mrs. Death by Selena Godin. Now this is a book that I had on my eye and on my TBRs at some point last year. I think I picked it up, I read a very teensy little bit of it, and then ended up putting it down and not getting back to it. This, I think, is going to have a slightly more contemplative, quiet feel to it. It is a relatively short book. I think it's in the 200s amount of pages. So it is maybe a little bit more like quiet and contemplative, which I think could work for both fall in that like cozy sit down rainy day kind of a feel, but I will also say that I think like quiet contemplative books also work really well for the winter. So if it pushes towards like the end of the year and I don't get it until then, that's also okay. I think it'll work well for then. And in this book we are following the personification of death, who is Mrs. Death, a Black working class woman who shapeshifts and does her work unseen, but she has had enough. She's exhausted from spending eternity doing her job and is seeking someone to unburden her conscience to. So I think the idea is that Death is like telling her story or parts of her stories to someone in particular. I do remember reading like even the foreword that was like what this book includes was just so different and out there. So I'm really looking forward to having something that's just like a little bit different from everything else that I've been reading lately. And I can't wait to give this one a go finally. Okay, now into another category, and that is my spooky books. Now I'm a little bit of a chicken. I do not read horror books at large, but there are some horror-leaning fantasy-related books that I am looking towards this year. I do have a particularly spooky-themed Pick My Next for October, but I don't want to spoil all of the books that you have an option to pick for me on that one. So some of the ones that I'm going to say here, maybe you will see again on that list. I don't always read everything from the list, but I do generally really want to read all of the ones that I do mention, but list is not exactly book for book what you're going to see on my Pick My Next for October, which is coming out October 1st. Make sure to check that out. So in this category, it is books that I think are a little bit more dark, maybe a little bit more eerie and spooky in tone, but still being like something that is manageable for me. They're not like outright horror gruesome books, but some that are like maybe on the journey towards being a little bit darker and gruesome, maybe a little bit more graphic than perhaps otherwise. And I'll start with Helm of Midnight for this one by Marina J. Lostetter. I have heard a few different people talk about this, and every time it comes up, I'm always like, yeah, I would maybe be up for reading that. So I think this season I'm probably just going to go for it. I think there's a sequel coming out as well. So that always like kind of lights the fire a little bit to make you want to pick up another book. And in this one, we're in a world where the magic has to do with these death masks, where you can imbue knowledge and traits, I believe as well, like even personality traits into somebody's death mask. And then someone who would put on that mask would then have that knowledge and those traits as well. So it's a way of passing down knowledge. But then the plot for our book is following a death mask of a famous serial killer which has gone missing. And I think we're following the detective who's on the case trying to find this death mask. And I think at the same time then there are murders happening that are in a very similar vein to that past serial killer. I've heard it's a little bit dark, a little bit thrillery, a little bit horror. I think it could be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Now this next one I think is also a little bit outside of my typical wheelhouse, and that is Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. And this says it is vampires and vaqueros face off on the Texas-Mexico border in this supernatural western from the author of La Hacienda. So I think this is something that's going to be a little bit out there for me, both in terms of like setting and time period in particular, because I think it's like 1840s. Yeah, it says. I don't normally read things set in that particular time period or like that modern maybe, but Reagan from Prue's Project was raving about it recently, and it really intrigued me. And then I think it has a little bit of a vampire element, which I don't normally go for, but I'm going to give it a go. So here's some of the synopsis. As the daughter of a rancher in 1940s Mexico, Nina knows a thing or two about monsters. Her home has long been threatened by tensions with Anglo settlers from the north, but something more sinister lurks near the ranch at night, something that drains men of their blood and leaves them for dead, something that once attacked Nina 9 years ago. From there, I think that we get into sort of like a past lost love where Nina had a lover or a potential partner who believed she died in this and disappeared, and that he thinks that she died and she thinks that he abandoned her. And then I think that we have like an upcoming war that potentially brings the two back together. And there's vampires and there's like a war and there's like some political stuff. I don't know. I think it sounds interesting, and I'm excited at the idea of something that pushes my boundaries a little bit, that pushes me outside of my comfort zone. So I'm going to give it a go. I hope that it brings like some like spooky horror kind of tones for the fall for me. And then the last like dedicated spooky fantasy one that I have here is Small Favors by Aaron A. Craig. This is the same author who wrote House of Salt and Sorrows. Now, this one I have heard mentioned by a few different channels, but really only occasionally, and they always kind of describe it as this like underhyped book that kind of flew under the radar, but that deserves a lot more attention. And so that kind of descriptor always makes me want to pick up that book. And I think this is a classic, like small town surrounded by a creepy woods where things start going wrong kind of setting. That is kind of all I know going into it. It has something to do with bees as seen on the cover, but like that's it. That's all I know. I've heard that it is like a little bit dark, a little bit like eerie. I've heard that the creepy atmosphere is done really well. So I don't know how actually like graphic and dark and scary it gets, but I've heard that the eerie, creepy atmosphere was perfectly done in this book. So I'm excited to potentially give this one a shot as well if I can get to it in the fall. Okay, and then my last category here is witchy vibes. So I only have 2 written down, but I'm definitely open to more witchy recommendations if you want to put down all of your favorite witchy books down below. Whether or not these I think have like 2 like distinctly separate vibes. So the first one is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. You'll probably hear me mention this book in a ton of videos recently or like before or after seeing this because it is really on my mind. I read the historical prequel Magic Lessons a couple years ago, and I've been meaning to pick up Practical Magic ever since, but I wanted to always read it in October specifically. So this October, I'm going to do it. And this is a classic witchy book. I think we're following 2 sisters who live with their aunts, and all I know about the story, the actual story, is that there's a curse on the women in this family for the men that they fall in love with to always die. And the prequel story that I read was actually the origins of that curse. And so this is more a contemporary novel following a witchy family. The sisters like living with their aunts feels like very like Sabrina Teenage Witch to me. I have actually never seen the movie, so I have no idea what happens in this story. I am really looking forward to getting to it. And then I'm hopefully going to continue on at some point with some of the other books in that series as well. And then the other witchy book that I have on this list is the X Hex by Erin Sterling. And I'm actually already reading this one. So this is more of a like zany, wonky witch contemporary romance where we're following, you know, like classic witch in the modern day kind of a story with a girl, our main character, our female lead, whose heart is broken by this other witch, Reese. And she kind of drunkenly, with her cousin, sets a curse on him. Just thinking it's just like saying silly nonsense. Except for when he comes back to town 9 years later, things start going awry. The town is kind of put at danger because of this curse, and the 2 of them have to pair up to figure out how to fix everything. So I know the Naughty Librarian like really liked this and like really loved how zany and fun it was. So as I said, I'm already started it, but I'm excited to see what it brings to the table. So as I said, if you have any other witchy related book recommendations for me, whether it is more in the contemporary witch romance kind of category or more of the like classic witch family story a la Practical Magic, hit me up down below. I'm open to reading more witchy books this year. Okay, so that is my fall vibes TBR for this year. All of the books that I have my eye on for this fall that I think bring a particularly fall atmospheric element to the table. Do you have any specific fall reads that you have your eye on for this year? If so, let me know down below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.